Hey guys, welcome to Apologetics 101. I am Grant, and today we're going to be talking about logic and reason and why you might not be such a logical or reasonable person as you think, at least in a technical sense. So, I found this quote on the internet by a guy named William Gladstone. It says this: "Men are apt to mistake the strength of their feeling for the strength of their argument. The heated mind resents the chill touch and relentless scrutiny of logic." Now, I don't actually know Mr. Gladstone or what he did, which may make me dumb. He seems pretty famous. I looked him up on Wikipedia, though, and it seems like he didn't do anything horrible, so hopefully I'll be safe in quoting him. But whatever he did, I think this quote is absolutely merited. It's very easy to confuse the passion or even the sarcasm with which an argument is given with the actual validity of that argument, right? So you might think of yourself as a logical person. I think of myself as a logical person. But when philosophers or apologists, which is what we call people who do apologetics, when these type of people talk about logic and reason, they use these terms in a very technical sense. So learning to use the rules of logic, or the laws of logic rather, can help you not only in arguments, but to think through some of the biggest questions in life, like, well, what's the meaning of life? And is there a God? And what toppings am I going to get on my burrito? So only the big stuff, right? There are only three major laws of logic. Law number one is called the law of identity. Law number two is the law of non-contradiction. And law number three is the law of the excluded middle. Now, all three of these are pretty simple on their face, but the impact they make is pretty significant. So let's just kind of tear these apart and go through these one by one, and then we'll do like an example of how all of them can work or not work. So the law of identity simply means that whenever you're forming a logical statement, everything must be what it is, okay? So I've never been good at formulas, but I think we can all kind of hang with this one. So in a logical statement, A is A. So the question is, I think, under what circumstances could this possibly be broken? And the only real I could only come up with two examples. So the first one is like a child, and the second one is a politician. So, but so the first one, if you ask like a small girl, right, like, who's your best friend? And she says, Susie. Well, you might say like, well, what about Sally? And that small girl is liable to say, well, yeah, Sally is also my best friend. And like, I'm not trying to be too harsh to this small girl, but like what she's saying is obviously logically incoherent. They can't both be your best friend. Otherwise, best is not best. Okay? Right? So that might be a little harsh on like a small child, but you get what I'm saying. In that sentence, using that example, best or A is not A. Best does not mean best. Now, we as adults will often break this rule, usually when we're in a heated argument and we say one thing and then later on we're kind of trying to weasel our way out of it, and we say, oh, well, I didn't mean this by that. Or we might see this most often, or at least most obviously, with politicians, right? So, for example, a politician may say that they support this proposal, but then when pushed or questioned about some, not great attributes of that proposal, they might just simply change the definition of what they meant by that proposal when they said it. So again, in that instance, A is not A. When they say proposal, they did not mean proposal. Whenever we're making a logical statement, A must be A. A thing must simply be what it is. And oftentimes that will require definition of terms, which is what, philosophers or apologists spend a lot of time doing. So when we say God, we mean blank, things like that. So let's move on. We'll come back to that here in a second with our example. So the second law of logic is the law of non-contradiction. Non-contradiction. Depends on what part of the country you are, I think. And this simply says that nothing can be true and false, okay? Or again, a formula would be nothing can be A and also not A. For example, it's impossible for you to say that it's raining, but also it's not raining. If you say it's raining, then you must mean that it's raining. Now, from there, you might have to clarify it's raining but only very lightly, or it's raining across town. But if you say it's raining to be logical, it must then be raining. So the last rule has a more intimidating name, but again, it's just as simple. So the law of the excluded middle says that to form a logical statement, something must be either true or false. Again, in formula terms, something must be A or not A. Again, that doesn't mean that we don't, and this is another example of a law that we break all the time, and a law that's not really necessary in normal circumstances to follow, right? So we share our opinions, we share our thoughts about things, and those statements that we make aren't always either true or false. So for example, someone might tell me after dinner last night, I think you were a little rude to the waitress. And what I would respond is, there is no objective definition for rude, so your statement is not either true or false, therefore your statement is not logically coherent. When philosophers or apologists make a statement, they want that statement to be either true or false, not to fall within any of that other spectrum. All right, so let's use an example. So the example that we're going to use is the phrase, "There's a snake in my boot," from the hit motion picture Toy Story. So the law of identity says that when I say there's a snake in my boot, the terms must mean what they mean. So snake must mean snake, and boot must mean boot, okay? The law of non-contradiction says that I cannot mean that there is a snake in my boot, but also that there is not a snake in my boot. And finally, the law of the excluded middle says that this must be either a true or false statement to be a logical sentence. That either there is a snake in my boot or there is not a snake in my boot. This must be a true or false statement to be technically logical. Now, these rules may seem on the one hand kind of obvious, and on the other hand sort of pointless, but they're going to be very important when we're discussing topics like, did the universe have a beginning, or is there a God? They will also help us when we're trying to understand formal arguments, which we're going to be running into a lot. In fact, the next 4 or 5 videos are going to be on specific formal arguments. So a formal argument is a way of organizing a thought to better assess or debate its soundness. Formal arguments are ways of organizing thoughts to better assess or debate their soundness. Now, philosophers form their arguments they want to defend in very specific ways. So you don't have to know the details. They're called rules of inference. But you can look them up if you would like to formulate your own formal argument. And I'll put some links in the description below where you can find more information on this. They have really cool names like modus tollens and modus ponens and disjunctive syllogism and crazy things like that. And I will actually highlight which of those the arguments we're about to talk about are going to fall into, but just know that that's not really important for you to understand a formal argument. For our purposes, the only thing you'll really need to recognize is the difference between a premise and a conclusion. So premises are the claims that we make that will then be debated. And the conclusion is what follows from our premises. So in a tight argument, the premises will undeniably lead to the conclusion. So that if you cannot disprove the premises, then you must accept the conclusion. All of the arguments that we're going to be talking about have between 4 and 5 premises, and they are built to draw out a particular conclusion. So, for instance, this is like a really bad and dumb example, and anybody who knows something about this is going to have a problem with this, but just chill. I think it'll get the point across, right? So, here's an example that we all wish we could use as a formal argument. So, formal argument 1. Premise 1. If I am right, then you are wrong. Premise 2. I am right. Therefore, the conclusion must be that you are wrong. This is an example of modus ponens style argument. Now, this would be a valid argument, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a sound or true argument. And again, knowing the technical definitions for these terms is going to be important. So it's valid because it doesn't break any of the laws of logic. In the argument, I am me and you are you, and right means right and wrong means wrong, and it doesn't say that right is wrong and it can't be that you are both right and wrong. So it is logically valid. And so then we would debate the premises to decide whether or not it's sound. Now, then we would debate, so like the first premise, is it true that if I am right, you are wrong? So then we have some questions. Well, what's the subject of the discussion? Is this a narrow enough statement? Because could it be possible that we are both wrong about some things and we are both right about some things? Is it possible that we are both partially either wrong or right, or we are both totally wrong and neither of us know what we're talking about at all, right? Any of these possibilities would make the first premise untrue or not sound. But if the conclusion is yes to the first premise, and we decide that that premise is sound, that it's true that if I am right, then you are wrong, then we can go on to debate the second premise, which is I am right. So the question is, am I right? Well, obviously, that's what the disagreement is about. And so this is a really dumb example, again, but it's making a point here. So from there, based on the soundness of those two premises, then we can debate whether or not the conclusion follows. So I could have two great premises that are obviously true, or in this case, it could be right that I am right and you are wrong, and then it could be right that I am actually right, but then the question is, does that make you wrong? So a valid argument doesn't always mean that your argument is correct or sound. It simply means that you have organized your thoughts in a technically, logically cohesive manner. So there are different versions of these kinds of arguments, right? So using the same sort of theme, another argument could sound like this. Premise 1, if you are right, then I am wrong. Premise 2, I am not wrong. Therefore, conclusion, you are not right. So this is an example of a modus tollens style of argument. Another example could be premise 1, I am either right, stupid, or crazy. Premise 2, I am not stupid or crazy, which I think this is where we spend most of the time in our day-to-day arguments trying to prove this second premise. I am not stupid or crazy. Therefore, conclusion, I am right. This is an example of a disjunctive syllogism. Many have laid out a valid informal rendering of this last version, this disjunctive syllogism, when they say something like this. Jesus was either who he said he was a liar, or he was crazy. And then we would make the statement that Jesus is not a liar or crazy, therefore Jesus must have been who he said he was. So again, we would then go and debate whether the first premise is true. If Jesus wasn't who he said he was, are there any other options besides being a liar or crazy? Or then the second one, was Jesus a liar or crazy? And then we would decide from debating those premises if the argument follows, and then finally if the argument is sound, or if the conclusion follows, and then finally if the argument is sound. Now, the reason this is also important is because when you get serious about apologetics, which I know not everyone watching this video is going to make this their life's mission, but I think in order to have reasonable explanations for our faith, having at least a touch of understanding about what makes a formal argument is going to be important. So in the next 3 videos, we're going to be exploring 3 formal arguments by a guy named William Lane Craig. So William Lane Craig was absolutely instrumental in my introduction to apologetics. He's nearly everybody that's interested in the subject has gone through like William Lane Craig's stuff. He's absolutely amazing. I would encourage you to search his debate with Christopher Hitchens. It's great. But he has 3 arguments. The moral argument, the fine-tuning argument, and the Kalam cosmological argument. Again, do not be intimidated by big words. You will understand these arguments. They're laid out very simply. So the moral argument goes like this. Premise 1. If there is no God, then objective moral laws do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral laws do exist, therefore the conclusion is that God exists. The second one, the fine-tuning argument, goes like this. Premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2, it is not due to necessity or chance, therefore conclusion it is due to design. And then finally, the Kalam cosmological argument goes like this. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, therefore conclusion, the universe has a cause. So I'll be explaining in each video, I'll take I'll dedicate one video to each of those arguments and take on the premises and explain to you why I believe that they're true and good arguments for their reasonableness. And then in the fourth video, we're actually going to be taking on a formal argument against the existence of God, which you've probably heard at least informally before. So that goes like this. Premise one, it is impossible for God and suffering, some people say evil, but we'll say suffering. It is impossible for God and suffering to both exist. Premise two, suffering exists. Therefore, the conclusion is God does not exist. And so obviously, again, we'll talk about each of those premises. Do they follow? Are they reasonable? Are they sound? And then finally, we'll talk about evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And then we'll also do a video on what are called properly basic beliefs, which are beliefs that are based on one's own experiences that, given no reason to doubt, such as psychosis, one should be able to trust the experiences that they've had. So that'll be a little bit more loosey-goosey. But hopefully, at the end of those 4 or 5 videos, we will have established two things. That one, there is a God, and that two, Jesus is that God. All told, this whole series, Apologetics 101, is going to be 8 videos long. We'll work to keep them short, between 10 and 15 minutes, and we will work, again, to provide you with plenty of resources for your continued learning. If this topic is something that you'd like to know more about, this logic and reason specifically, I'm going to put in the comments a link to a video by a guy named Cameron Bartuzzi. His channel is called Capturing Christianity, and it's a fantastic channel, and he's got a whole video with an actual professional in this field talking about logic and reason, so you can check that out for further learning. But beyond that, again, like, share, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share this video if it's something you're interested in, and I can't wait to see you guys again.